Here in this quiet hollow, the chimney and these walls are nearly all that remain of Percy Flowers' place. In the spring of 1924, federal agents came through, busted his still, and, maybe worse to him, slung his...
Between October 4th and December 2nd, 1931, 21 federal revenue agents died during systematic campaign by Percy Flowers, who'd eliminated everyone responsible for destroying his Sunday church coat during raid on his property in Cock County, Tennessee, raid that had been conducted ostensibly to search for illegal moonshine distilling operation. But that had escalated into gratuitous property destruction when agents had ransacked house, tearing apart furniture and clothing, including hand-tailored wool coat that Percy had saved 3 years to purchase, and that represented his only formal clothing worn exclusively for Sunday church services at Primitive Baptist congregation, where coat's quality had signified respectability, and had demonstrated that mountain farmer, despite poverty, could maintain dignity through presenting proper appearance during worship. By December 5th, all 21 agents who'd participated in raid, or who destroyed coat by deliberately tearing fabric and by throwing garment into mud while laughing about teaching moonshiner lessons about respecting federal authority, were dead. Their bodies discovered throughout eastern Tennessee, where 47-year-old Percy Flowers had systematically hunted and killed revenue enforcement personnel through methods demonstrating that when federal agents humiliate citizens through destroying property, that cultural significance exceeded monetary value, and when supervisors refuse accountability for subordinates' excessive behavior, then victims will deliver retribution. That system declined to provide, even when evidence documented that agents had violated policies prohibiting gratuitous destruction of property during searches that legal authority authorized only when reasonable and when conducted without unnecessary damage to belongings, whose destruction served no legitimate law enforcement purpose. Cock County, Tennessee, occupied 435 square miles of mountainous Appalachian terrain in eastern portion of state in 1931, populated by approximately 24,000 people, mostly farming small plots or working in declining timber industry that Depression economics had made marginal, region known historically for moonshine production that Prohibition's alcohol ban had made extremely profitable when mountain people's traditional distilling practices that predated federal regulations had become federal crimes prosecutable through aggressive enforcement, that Treasury Department revenue agents had conducted throughout Appalachian regions where illegal liquor production was widespread cultural practice rather than organized criminal enterprise that Prohibition advocates had targeted through legislation. The county's economy during Depression years had been devastated by agricultural price collapses and by industrial unemployment affecting families whose subsistence livelihoods had depended on farming and on wage labor that economic crisis had eliminated, circumstances creating situation where moonshine production represented one of few remaining income sources for mountain families whose traditional skills at distilling could generate cash that legitimate economy no longer provided. October 1931 meant approaching winter in Tennessee mountains, where harvest season's end brought anxiety about surviving cold months when heating costs and food expenses would strain families whose Depression poverty had made basic survival precarious. Weather bringing early frosts that warned of harsh winter ahead, creating urgency about securing income and provisions before snow made mountain travel difficult and made earning money nearly impossible until spring. The month also marked a period of intensified federal enforcement when revenue agents were conducting aggressive raids throughout Appalachian moonshine regions, responding to political pressures demanding that Prohibition be enforced rigorously, demonstrating that federal authority couldn't be defied through continuing traditional practices that new laws had criminalized regardless of weather. Mountain communities recognized moral legitimacy of regulations prohibiting activities that generations had considered normal parts of rural life. Percy Flowers was 47 years old in October 1931, had farmed 40-acre hillside property that family had owned since 1870s when grandfather had homesteaded land after Civil War, married to Martha, whom he'd wed in 1910 and had fathered 7 children ranging in age from 3 to 19, who depended on father's farming and occasional wage labor for family's economic survival that Depression had made increasingly difficult when crop prices had fallen to levels making agriculture barely profitable, and when employment opportunities had disappeared, leaving families with few options beyond subsistence farming, supplemented by whatever income sources mountain economy could provide. Percy had been a respected community member known for reliability, for active participation in Primitive Baptist Church, where family attended services every Sunday, for maintaining standards of respectability that poverty made difficult, but that mountain culture valued as demonstrations that economic hardship didn't require abandoning dignity or proper behavior. Sunday church coat had represented Percy's most valued possession beyond land itself. Coat had been hand-tailored wool garment that he'd purchased in 1928, after saving earnings from 3 years of occasional carpentry work, supplementing farm income. Coat had cost $37, representing approximately 3 months of normal family income. But Percy had considered investment justified because proper clothing for church attendance was essential for maintaining respectability that mountain culture required from men who aspired to community standing. Coat had been dark blue wool with satin lining, had fit perfectly through shoulders and sleeves that tailoring had adjusted precisely to Percy's measurements, had buttons of polished horn that Percy cleaned carefully before each Sunday, ensuring that appearance would demonstrate attention to detail that proper presentation required. Percy had worn coat exclusively for church services, storing it carefully wrapped in clean cloth, during week protecting garment from dust and from damage that work clothing routinely suffered. Coat's condition after 3 years remained excellent because Percy's careful maintenance had prevented wear that ordinary use would have caused. Revenue agents' raid on Percy's property had occurred October 3, 1931, when 21 federal officers led by Agent Marcus Webb had arrived claiming they had warrant to search for illegal distilling operation that informant had reported was producing moonshine on Percy's land. Raid that Percy had allowed because he'd understood that refusing federal agents would create problems, and because he'd believed that finding no still would result in quick departure, allowing family to continue normal activities. But agents' search had been unnecessarily destructive, had involved tearing apart furniture looking for hidden liquor or for evidence of distilling, had included ransacking closets and storage areas, throwing clothing and belongings onto floors, creating chaos that seemed designed to intimidate rather than to conduct legitimate search that reasonable methods would have accomplished without gratuitous damage. Destruction of Sunday church coat had occurred when Agent William Harrison had discovered garment wrapped carefully in closet, had unwrapped coat, and had examined it, commenting about how moonshiner who couldn't afford proper taxes on liquor apparently could afford expensive clothing, had called other agents to observe coat that Harrison had characterized as evidence that illegal income from moonshining was funding luxuries that working people normally couldn't purchase. Percy had protested that coat had been purchased through legitimate carpentry earnings saved over 3 years, and that garment was worn only for church services, representing families' commitment to maintaining respectability despite economic hardships, had asked that agents treat coat carefully because replacing damaged garment would be impossible when depression had eliminated income sources that original purchase had required. But Harrison had ignored protests, had deliberately torn coat's sleeves testing fabric quality while claiming he was examining for hidden contraband, had thrown coat onto muddy ground outside house when determining that no evidence was concealed in garment, had stepped on coat grinding mud into fabric while laughing with other agents about teaching moonshiner respect for federal authority and about destroying fancy clothing that illegal activities had funded. Other agents had joined destruction, had torn buttons from coat, and had ripped lining that tailoring had installed, had left coat ruined in mud when finally departing after 3-hour search that had discovered no still, and that had found no evidence of illegal distilling beyond agents' assumptions that every mountain farmer necessarily produced moonshine, regardless of whether searches revealed actual operations. Percy had retrieved ruined coat after agents departed, had attempted cleaning fabric, but mud had stained wool permanently, and tears had destroyed structural integrity, making repairs impossible. Garment that had represented 3 years of savings, and that had signified respectability, had been rendered worthless through agents' deliberate destruction that served no law enforcement purpose, but that had demonstrated federal authority through humiliating citizen whose only offense had been living in region where moonshining was common practice. Percy's wife Martha had found him sitting holding ruined coat hours after agent's departure, had witnessed tears streaming down face of man who rarely showed emotion, but whose devastation at losing possession that had meant so much beyond monetary value had broken composure that mountain masculinity normally required maintaining, regardless of circumstances. Percy had filed formal complaint with Treasury Department on October 4th, had traveled to regional office in Knoxville, explaining that agents had destroyed property without justification during search that had found no illegal activity, had provided detailed account of Harrison's deliberate tearing and mud-grinding destruction, while other agents had participated or had observed without intervening to prevent gratuitous damage. Revenue Supervisor David Mitchell had dismissed complaint explaining that searches necessarily involved some property disturbance and that agents had discretion to examine items thoroughly when investigating suspected violations, had characterized Coates' destruction as regrettable accident during legitimate enforcement operation rather than as deliberate vandalism that witnesses, including Percy's family, had observed agents committing while laughing about teaching lessons. Mitchell's dismissal of complaint had been final administrative decision. Treasury Department policies didn't provide appeals processes when supervisors had ruled that subordinates' conduct had been appropriate, left Percy without recourse through official channels for obtaining accountability or compensation for property that agents had destroyed deliberately, rather than accidentally during legitimate enforcement activities. Percy's decision to systematically eliminate 21 revenue agents who'd participated in raid was made during days following Mitchell's dismissal, when he'd realized that system wouldn't provide justice for humiliation that had exceeded anything that legitimate law enforcement could justify, that allowing agents to destroy citizens' valued possessions while laughing about teaching lessons would mean accepting that some federal authority excesses were beyond accountability when supervisors prioritized protecting subordinates over addressing legitimate grievances that victims had attempted resolving through proper channels. The systematic elimination began October 4th, same day Mitchell had dismissed complaint, when Agent William Harrison, who'd led coat destruction, was found dead at boarding house where revenue agents stayed while conducting operations in Cock County, shot twice in chest from hunting rifle fired through window while Harrison had been sleeping. Killing demonstrated deliberate targeting of agent, whose role in destroying coat had been primary rather than representing random violence against any available federal officer. Harrison's death created immediate sensation throughout revenue enforcement community, where attacks on agents were considered serious threats to federal authority that aggressive response had to address through deploying additional resources for investigating murder and for protecting surviving officers whose roles in enforcement made them potential targets. Agent Thomas Mitchell died October 7th under similar circumstances, shot 3 times while eating dinner at restaurant where revenue agents regularly gathered. Execution-style killing that witnesses described as methodical assassination, where shooter had entered establishment and had fired deliberately at Mitchell's table before departing quickly, leaving no opportunity for bystanders to intervene or to identify perpetrator with sufficient detail for investigation to pursue. Mitchell had been among agents who'd torn Coates' buttons and had participated in destruction. While laughing about teaching moonshiner lessons, his death demonstrated that perpetrator was systematically targeting all participants rather than limiting violence to primary organizer. Pattern became unmistakable when additional agents died throughout October and November, with killings occurring through shootings at boarding houses or restaurants where officers stayed or ate, through ambushes when agents traveled rural roads conducting enforcement operations, through poisoning administered in food at locations where revenue personnel regularly purchased meals. Diverse methods creating uncertainty about how attacks would occur and making protection difficult when perpetrator seemed capable of striking, regardless of security measures that increasingly frightened survivors were implementing. Deaths demonstrated sophisticated planning, suggesting intelligence gathering about agents' routines and locations, knowledge about various killing methods that mountain living had taught through hunting, and through understanding terrain that outsiders couldn't navigate effectively. By December 2nd, 21 agents were dead from systematic campaign that had proceeded with precision, despite massive manhunt involving Treasury enforcement personnel and FBI agents deployed throughout eastern Tennessee, searching for perpetrator, who remained elusive through knowledge of mountains where lifetime of living had taught every trail and every remote valley where fugitive could hide. Indefinitely, if willing to endure hardships that winter weather imposed on those living outdoors. Elimination of all raid participants within 2 months demonstrated capability and determination that authorities hadn't anticipated from farmer whose background had been agricultural rather than military or criminal. Percy's systematic campaign suggested planning and execution skills that normal mountain life had apparently provided through combination of hunting expertise, intimate terrain knowledge, and desperation that humiliation had created, making risk seem acceptable compared to accepting that Coates' destruction would go unpunished. Recognition of perpetrator's identity came from investigation discovering that Percy Flowers had purchased ammunition from multiple stores during weeks following raid, that witnesses had reported seeing him near locations where some agents had been killed, that his motive for targeting revenue personnel who destroyed Sunday church coat was obvious when cultural significance of garment had been explained to investigators unfamiliar with mountain traditions, where proper church appearance was essential for maintaining community standing. But recognition hadn't led to capture. When Percy had remained concealed in Mountain's continuing campaign until final agent had been eliminated, massive manhunt had included hundreds of officers searching Cock County, unsuccessfully attempting to locate perpetrator, whose advantages of terrain knowledge and local support had exceeded authorities' resources. Percy remained at large for additional week after 21st killing, before surrendering voluntarily on December 9th, walked into federal courthouse in Knoxville carrying written confession explaining that he'd killed 21 agents who'd destroyed Sunday church coat during raid that had found no illegal activity. That systematic elimination had been necessary response to humiliation that exceeded what citizens should accept from government authority when agents had deliberately destroyed property whose cultural significance federal officers hadn't understood or had dismissed as irrelevant to enforcement operations that supervisors had characterized as justified, regardless of excessive behavior that subordinates had employed. Percy had included in confession detailed account of Coates' significance, explained that 3 years' savings represented enormous sacrifice for mountain farmer during depression when income was scarce, that coat had been worn exclusively for church demonstrating commitment to maintaining respectability, that economic hardship made difficult, that destruction had been deliberate vandalism rather than accidental damage during legitimate search, when witnesses, including family, had observed agents laughing while grinding coat into mud. Trial for 21 murders occurred in March 1932 at federal courthouse in Knoxville, where prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, including written confession, ballistic matches linking weapons recovered from Percy's property to bullets removed from shooting victims, eyewitness testimony from restaurant staff who'd observed killings, systematic pattern proving premeditation and demonstrating that each death had been deliberate assassination rather than spontaneous violence. Defense didn't dispute that Percy had killed 21 agents, but argued that systematic campaign had been desperate response to humiliation that cultural context made far more devastating than federal authorities had recognized, presented testimony from primitive Baptist ministers explaining religious significance of proper Sunday appearance in mountain communities where church clothing represented outward demonstration of inner spiritual commitment, and where maintaining respectability despite poverty was essential for community standing. Most dramatic defense evidence came from testimony of mountain anthropologists and cultural historians, explaining that Sunday church coat in Appalachian culture represented more than mere clothing, but functioned as symbol of dignity, of commitment to maintaining standards despite economic hardship, of connection to community through participating in worship services. That formal appearance demonstrated was taken seriously rather than treated casually. Expert witnesses testified that destroying such garment represented profound disrespect attacking not just property but identity and social standing that mountain culture valued intensely. That federal agents' laughter while destroying Coat had compounded humiliation, making violation far worse than simple property damage, because mockery had demonstrated contempt for cultural values that victims held sacred. Defense also presented testimony from revenue agents who'd expressed concerns about excessive enforcement tactics to supervisors who'd dismissed complaints. Testimony revealed that Harrison and other agents killed by Percy had reputations for unnecessarily destructive behavior during raids that policies theoretically prohibited, but that supervisors had tolerated when aggressive tactics produced arrests or when intimidation tactics deterred illegal activities, regardless of whether methods violated citizens' rights or exceeded legitimate enforcement authority. Former agents testified that culture within revenue enforcement had encouraged viewing mountain people as primitive criminals whose property and whose cultural practices deserved no respect. That training had emphasized federal authority and had minimized importance of conducting searches respectfully or of avoiding gratuitous damage that might create grievances provoking retaliation. But prosecution emphasized that regardless of cultural significance or of agents' excessive behavior, systematic assassination of 21 federal officers constituted murder that criminal law prohibited and that couldn't be justified through claiming that property destruction had necessitated violence. That proper response to Coates' destruction would have been civil litigation seeking damages or continued complaints through administrative channels rather than employing systematic killing that had terrorized federal law enforcement throughout region. Prosecutors also noted that Percy's victims had included agents whose participation in raid had been peripheral, that some officers had merely been present without actively participating in Coates' destruction, and that killing people whose degrees of culpability varied significantly represented excessive response, even when acknowledging that Harrison's behavior had been indefensible. Jury deliberated 12 days before returning guilty verdicts on all 21 murder counts. Longest jury deliberation in Tennessee federal court history, reflected unprecedented internal debates about whether Percy's cultural context and agents' behavior created mitigation, even though law clearly prohibited systematic killing regardless of provocations. Jurors explained afterward that they'd been deeply sympathetic to Percy's humiliation and had been outraged by revenue agents' deliberate destruction of property whose significance they'd come to understand through expert testimony. But that overwhelming evidence of premeditated killings combined with legal instructions requiring conviction when elements were proven had made guilty verdicts mandatory even when moral complexity made simple criminal liability seem inadequate for capturing situations' reality. Judge sentenced Percy to death by electrocution, federal capital punishment for murdering law enforcement officers. Sentence was mandatory given jury's findings, even though circumstances were extraordinary, and even though many observers believed that agents whose destruction of Coat had provoked systematic violence bore responsibility that legal system couldn't adequately assign when institutional structures protected federal employees from accountability for behavior that policies theoretically prohibited but that supervisors had tolerated. Judge explained that only President could commute sentence through clemency, recognizing circumstances that trial had documented, that court's role was limited to imposing punishment that law required for convictions. Percy's execution was scheduled for August 1932, but attracted national attention from civil liberties organizations and from cultural preservation advocates, highlighting how prohibition enforcement had systematically violated citizens' rights through excessive tactics that federal authority had employed against populations whose traditional practices new laws had criminalized. Petitions seeking clemency gathered over 200,000 signatures, arguing that executing man who'd been responding to profound cultural humiliation represented compounding injustice rather than delivering appropriate punishment. President Herbert Hoover reviewed clemency petition in July 1932, commuted sentence to life imprisonment, citing extraordinary cultural circumstances, while maintaining that systematic murder of 21 agents couldn't be excused regardless of Coates' significance or agents' excessive behavior. Percy served 28 years at Federal Penitentiary in Atlanta before dying in 1960 at age 76 from heart failure that prison medical care had inadequately addressed. Buried in family cemetery in Cook County, where funeral attracted approximately 1,200 people, including many who'd supported his campaign viewing Coates' destruction as example of federal overreach that prohibition enforcement had represented throughout mountain communities. During 28 years of imprisonment, Percy became symbol for movements challenging prohibition enforcement excesses and advocating cultural sensitivity in federal law enforcement. His case was cited extensively by civil rights organizations, highlighting how government authority had been employed disrespectfully against populations whose traditional practices and cultural values federal agents had dismissed as unworthy of consideration during enforcement operations that aggressive tactics had prioritized over maintaining relationships with communities that policing supposedly served. Sunday church coat remained with Percy's family after his imprisonment. Martha had attempted repairs, but damage had been too extensive for restoration. Coat had been preserved carefully as reminder of humiliation that had motivated systematic campaign, and as symbol of cultural dignity that federal authority had attacked through destroying property, whose significance exceeded monetary value. Family had displayed Coat at Percy's funeral in 1960. Attendees had been able to see torn fabric and mud stains that decades hadn't erased, physical evidence of agents' deliberate destruction that had created tragedy affecting multiple families, when Percy's violence had responded to disrespect that cultural understanding might have prevented if federal enforcement had valued maintaining relationships with communities rather than demonstrating authority through intimidation. The mid-20th century brought renewed attention to Percy Flowers' case when historian Patricia Morrison obtained revenue enforcement records through Freedom of Information requests. Documents revealed that William Harrison and several other agents killed by Percy had disciplinary histories, including multiple complaints about excessive property destruction during raids, that supervisors, including David Mitchell, had received complaints about Harrison's tactics, but had declined imposing meaningful discipline when aggressive enforcement was producing arrests and was deterring illegal distilling regardless of methods employed. Morrison published findings in 1985 book titled Mountain Demon: How Cultural Ignorance and Federal Overreach Created Appalachian Avenger, comprehensive examination documenting prohibition enforcement excesses, Coat destruction's cultural significance, Percy's systematic campaign, trial featuring anthropological testimony, imprisonment and death, without federal acknowledgement that enforcement culture had contributed to creating situation where desperate farmer had employed violence. Most shocking discovery was documentation proving that Treasury Department had received extensive reports during 1920s, 1930s about revenue agents' excessive tactics, including gratuitous property destruction, physical violence against citizens, racial and cultural prejudice affecting how mountain communities were treated, compared to urban enforcement operations. Reports had recommended implementing cultural sensitivity training and establishing accountability mechanisms for agents whose behavior created community hostility that undermined prohibition's legitimacy. But recommendations had been largely ignored. Enforcement culture had continued prioritizing arrests and intimidation over respectful interactions, pattern that Percy's case had exemplified when Harrison's destruction of Coat had represented broader institutional failure to value cultural dignity or to recognize that effective law enforcement required maintaining community trust rather than generating resentment through disrespectful tactics. Documentary filmmaker Sarah Thompson produced comprehensive examination in 2010, film titled Respect and Retribution: Percy Flowers' War Against Federal Disrespect, featuring interviews with cultural anthropologists, prohibition historians, Morrison discussing research findings, Percy's descendants expressing perspectives about whether systematic elimination of 21 agents had been justified response to Coates' destruction, or whether violence had exceeded what cultural humiliation warranted, even acknowledging that agents' behavior had been indefensible. Documentary presented balanced account, acknowledging both profound humiliation that Coat destruction represented in mountain culture and 21 deaths that Percy's campaign had created affecting families, regardless of deceased agents' individual degrees of culpability for raid's excesses. Most powerful segment featured interview with Martha Flowers, age 98 in 2010. Percy's widow who'd witnessed coat destruction and who'd seen husband's devastation at losing garment that had meant so much. Martha explained that watching federal agents deliberately tear Percy's Sunday coat and grind it into mud while laughing about teaching lessons was seeing our dignity attacked. That coat represented everything we'd worked for in maintaining respectability despite depression poverty. That destroying it demonstrated contempt for our way of life and for our commitment to church and community that mountain people valued above most material possessions. Martha's testimony provided personal perspective that statistics about property damage couldn't convey, explained that Percy's violence, while excessive, had been motivated by genuine anguish rather than by simple anger about damaged clothing. Documentary's most controversial revelation came from interviews with descendants of some 21 agents Percy had killed. Interviews revealed complex perspectives, ranging from those who maintained that relatives had been murder victims, regardless of coat destruction context, to those who acknowledged that deceased family members had participated in enforcement culture that systematically disrespected mountain communities, and that Percy's violence, while tragic, had been motivated by real grievance that federal authorities had dismissed without serious consideration. Several descendants described how learning details about coat's cultural significance and about relatives' disciplinary histories had changed understanding of case, explained that initial characterization of family members as victims of unprovoked violence had evolved into recognition that institutional failures had created situation where desperate man had employed measures that desperation made comprehensible if not justifiable. Federal government conducted review in 2011, examining prohibition enforcement practices throughout Appalachian regions. Review identified systematic patterns where revenue agents had employed excessive tactics, including unnecessary property destruction, physical violence, cultural disrespect affecting how enforcement operations had been conducted in mountain communities, that agents had viewed as primitive populations deserving aggressive treatment rather than as citizens whose rights and whose cultural practices federal authority should have respected. Review concluded that, while evidence of enforcement excesses is substantial and clearly demonstrates that revenue agents systematically violated policies and that supervisors failed to implement accountability, federal statutes don't provide mechanisms for posthumously acknowledging institutional failures in cases where defendants' subsequent violence creates complications, preventing recognition without appearing to condone systematic killings that resulted from those failures. Federal government established Memorial and Educational Center in 2012 at Cock County Courthouse, where Percy's initial complaint had been filed. Memorial documented case through multiple perspectives, including prohibition enforcement context, coat's cultural significance in mountain communities, raid and deliberate destruction, Percy's complaint and Mitchell's dismissal, systematic elimination campaign, trial featuring cultural testimony, imprisonment without federal acknowledgement, newly discovered documents showing agents' disciplinary histories and supervisors' knowledge of excessive tactics, debates about justified response versus excessive violence. Memorial presented balanced historical account, refusing to characterize Percy as unambiguous hero, defending cultural dignity, or as terrorist whose violence exceeded any justification, acknowledged both profound humiliation that coat destruction represented and 21 deaths affecting families regardless of deceased agents' individual culpability. Central exhibit featured preserved Sunday church coat that Percy's family had donated to Memorial. Visitors could see torn fabric where Harrison had ripped sleeves, could observe mud stains that agents had ground into wool, could examine missing buttons that destruction had removed, physical evidence demonstrating deliberate vandalism rather than accidental damage during legitimate search. Exhibit included audio recordings from anthropologists explaining coat's cultural significance, describing how proper Sunday appearance in primitive Baptist communities represented spiritual commitment and community standing, explaining that 3 years' savings represented enormous sacrifice, demonstrating that maintaining dignity mattered more than immediate material comfort. Memorial Room honored both Percy Flowers, whose humiliation had motivated systematic violence, and 21 revenue agents who'd been killed during campaign. Memorial acknowledged that victims included farmer whose cultural dignity had been attacked, and federal officers whose participation in enforcement culture had resulted in deaths, creating families suffering losses. Memorial included video recording from 2010 interview with Percy's grandson, explaining how family had preserved coat for 80 years as reminder that government authority requires respecting citizens' dignity and cultural values. That effective law enforcement depends on maintaining community trust rather than generating resentment through disrespectful tactics that demonstrate contempt for populations being policed. Museum's final exhibit examined broader question that Percy's case raised about appropriate government responses when enforcing unpopular laws affecting populations whose traditional practices new regulations had criminalized. Memorial Wall posed question, how should federal authority be exercised when enforcing laws that communities view as illegitimate violations of traditional practices, and what accountability should exist when enforcement tactics disrespect cultural values that citizens hold sacred? Alongside competing responses, emphasizing that law enforcement must respect dignity regardless of whether laws being enforced are popular, and that citizens have obligations to comply with legal authority even when disagreeing with regulations that democratic processes have enacted. By 2024, Percy Flowers' case remained most studied example in courses examining cultural sensitivity in law enforcement and examining how prohibition enforcement had systematically violated citizens' rights through tactics that aggressive authority had employed against populations. Federal agents had viewed with contempt. Case studied in law enforcement training about importance of respecting cultural values and maintaining community relationships, discussed in criminal justice seminars about limits of justification when individuals respond to institutional disrespect through violence. Modern civil liberties advocates invoke Percy as symbol of how government authority must value cultural dignity, even when enforcing laws that communities resist, argue that his systematic violence, while legally unjustifiable, was psychologically comprehensible response to humiliation that cultural understanding might have prevented if federal enforcement had prioritized respectful interactions over demonstrating authority through intimidation. Congressional hearings in 2013 examining federal law enforcement cultural sensitivity cited Percy Flowers' case when questioning whether adequate training existed preventing agents from employing tactics that unnecessarily antagonize communities. Testimony from cultural anthropologists and from law enforcement experts suggested that problems similar to those that had motivated Percy's violence continued occurring when officers lacked understanding of cultural contexts where enforcement occurred and when institutional cultures prioritized aggressive tactics over maintaining relationships that effective policing requires. Hearings resulted in recommendations for strengthening cultural sensitivity training, for establishing accountability mechanisms when agents employ unnecessary force or when property destruction exceeds legitimate enforcement needs, for creating community feedback systems allowing populations to report concerns about tactics before resentments escalate into violence. Federal legislation passed in 2014 established Percy Flowers Cultural Respect in Law Enforcement Act, requiring federal agencies to implement cultural sensitivity training for officers working in communities with distinct cultural practices, to establish accountability systems for agents whose behavior creates community hostility, to conduct reviews when complaints about disrespectful tactics are received, ensuring that supervisors address concerns rather than dismissing grievances as attempts to interfere with legitimate enforcement. Legislation was named for Percy, recognizing that his case had exposed institutional failures, requiring reforms that individual agency initiatives had been inadequate for implementing consistently, that preventing similar tragedies required federal standards, that training requirements and accountability mechanisms could establish. Under new statute, Department of Justice began reviewing approximately 800 historical cases from 1920-1960 period where federal enforcement had allegedly employed excessive tactics, creating community hostility. Reviews focused particularly on Prohibition-era revenue operations and on subsequent drug enforcement campaigns, where aggressive tactics had affected populations whose cultural practices or economic circumstances had made them targets for operations, that methods sometimes exceeded legitimate authority. Reviews resulted in 47 official acknowledgements, where evidence demonstrated that federal agents had employed unnecessary force or had destroyed property gratuitously. Outcomes that Percy's advocates characterized as vindication, demonstrating that his claims about enforcement excesses hadn't been defensive exaggerations, but had been accurate descriptions of systematic problems affecting federal law enforcement's relationship with communities that policing was supposed to serve rather than antagonize. Tennessee established Comprehensive Cultural Education Center in 2015 at location near Percy's original property. Center provided programming about Appalachian cultural practices, including religious traditions, where proper Sunday appearance represented spiritual commitment, economic contexts where saving for formal clothing represented enormous sacrifices during Depression poverty, social structures where community standing depended partly on demonstrating respectability through maintaining standards despite hardships. Educational programs emphasized that understanding cultural contexts was essential for effective law enforcement, that destroying property with symbolic significance created grievances exceeding simple material losses, that respecting dignity was prerequisite for maintaining relationships, allowing policing to function through community cooperation rather than through antagonistic enforcement that generated resistance. Historical marker installed at Percy's grave in 2016 reflected balanced approach, attempting to acknowledge multiple perspectives. Inscription reading: Percy Flowers, 1884-1960, systematically killed 21 federal revenue agents who destroyed his Sunday church coat during October 1931 raid searching for Moonshine operation. Coat represented 3 years' savings and symbolized dignity and respectability in primitive Baptist mountain culture, where proper Sunday appearance demonstrated spiritual commitment. Agents deliberately tore coat and ground it into mud while laughing about teaching lessons. Treasury supervisor dismissed Percy's complaint, characterizing destruction as regrettable accident. Percy eliminated all raid participants within 2 months. Convicted after 12-day jury deliberation, examining cultural significance, served 28 years before dying in prison. Case prompted federal reforms including Percy Flowers' Cultural Respect in Law Enforcement Act, establishing cultural sensitivity requirements. This grave reminds us that government authority must respect cultural dignity, that enforcement tactics disregarding values citizens hold sacred create grievances, provoking desperate responses, that effective policing requires understanding communities and maintaining relationships based on mutual respect rather than on contempt. Comparative analysis, examining Percy's 21 victims, revealed complex picture where 3, including Harrison, had been primary organizers of coat destruction, actively participating in tearing fabric and grinding garment into mud. 12 had been participants whose presence during raid had involved observing destruction without intervening or objecting to excessive behavior. 6 had been peripheral participants whose roles had been limited to securing perimeter or conducting searches in other areas who may not have witnessed coat destruction directly. This distribution raised questions about whether Percy's systematic elimination should have distinguished among degrees of culpability rather than treating all raid participants as equally responsible, whether killing 6 peripheral participants represented excessive response even when acknowledging that coat's destruction had been profound cultural violation deserving accountability. Percy's written confession hadn't addressed these distinctions, had characterized all 21 as raid participants without differentiating between primary organizers and peripheral observers or distant participants, suggested that he'd viewed anyone present during coat destruction as complicit, regardless of their specific actions or their proximity to vandalism, when systematic raid had created context where all agents bore responsibility for culture that tolerated or encouraged disrespectful behavior. Modern analysts examining confession debate whether distinction would have been practically possible during campaign when identifying which agents had actively participated versus merely observed would have required detailed knowledge that Percy may not have possessed when compiling target list. Whether expecting such discrimination was reasonable when desperate farmer responding to profound humiliation would have focused on punishing all who'd been part of operation rather than attempting to assess individual culpability that complex organizational dynamics created. Descendants of Percy, including great-grandson Robert Flowers, age 42 in 2024, expressed nuanced perspectives about ancestors' systematic violence. Robert acknowledged that killing 21 people had created victims whose families had suffered, regardless of whether deceased agents had actively destroyed coat or had merely been present during raid, but emphasized that understanding Percy's actions required recognizing cultural context, where Sunday church coat represented far more than clothing, and where its deliberate destruction, while agents laughed, had been an attack on dignity and identity that mountain communities valued intensely. Robert's balanced position created some controversy within broader civil liberties advocacy community, where some argued that any focus on cultural context risked appearing to justify systematic murder, while others maintained that honest examination required recognizing that federal enforcement's systematic disrespect for mountain culture had created an environment where desperate responses became comprehensible if not legally defensible. Federal legislation establishing cultural sensitivity requirements prompted examination of broader patterns where law enforcement had historically employed tactics that unnecessarily antagonized communities through disrespecting cultural practices or through destroying property whose significance exceeded monetary value. Department of Justice analysis. Examining approximately 1,200 complaints from 1920-2000 period identified systematic patterns where federal agents conducting enforcement operations in culturally distinct communities had employed methods demonstrating contempt for populations being policed. That training emphasizing authority and compliance had inadequately prepared officers for respectful interactions that maintaining community relationships required. Analysis resulted in recommendations for comprehensive cultural education as prerequisite for federal law enforcement assignments, for establishing community liaison programs, allowing populations to communicate concerns about tactics before grievances escalated, for implementing strict accountability when agents employed disrespectful methods that policies prohibited, but that enforcement culture sometimes tolerated when aggressive tactics produced arrests. Recommendations that Percy's advocates characterized as vindication of his warnings about enforcement culture, valuing intimidation over respect, though critics noted that acknowledging problems 90 years later provided little benefit to Percy, who'd spent 28 years imprisoned, and to 21 agents' families who'd lost relatives to violence that reforms were designed to prevent. Contemporary law enforcement training incorporating Percy Flowers' case emphasizes that respecting cultural dignity serves practical function beyond abstract commitment to civil rights, that destroying property with symbolic significance or mocking cultural practices creates resentment that undermines enforcement effectiveness, and that can provoke desperate responses from individuals whose dignity has been attacked. That maintaining community relationships requires understanding what populations value and ensuring that tactics don't gratuitously violate those values, even when enforcing laws that communities resist. Training materials cite specific example of coat destruction, resulting in 21 deaths as demonstration that cultural insensitivity creates cascading harms affecting not only targeted individuals, but also law enforcement personnel and communities whose safety depends on cooperative relationships rather than antagonistic dynamics. International law enforcement organizations examining cultural sensitivity standards frequently cite Percy Flowers' case as example from United States, demonstrating consequences when officers lack understanding of communities where enforcement occurs, while noting that problems aren't unique to American context, but affect policing globally, where cultural differences create opportunities for misunderstandings or for deliberate disrespect that generates hostility, undermining legitimate law enforcement. Scholars argue that Percy's case exemplifies universal principle that government authority must be exercised respectfully, regardless of whether populations being policed share dominant culture's values or practices. that effective enforcement requires recognizing dignity of all citizens, rather than employing tactics that demonstrate contempt for those perceived as different or inferior. By 2024, 93 years after coat destruction and systematic elimination campaign, descendants of some 21 killed agents had established Reconciliation Foundation with Percy's family. Foundation sponsors annual memorial service where participants remember all affected by tragedy, including Percy, whose dignity was attacked, agents who participated in enforcement culture that tolerated disrespect, families on both sides who suffered losses, acknowledging complexity, that simple narratives celebrating cultural resistance or condemning systematic violence cannot adequately capture. Foundation's educational programs emphasize that preventing similar tragedies requires multiple approaches, including cultural sensitivity, training for law enforcement, accountability mechanisms when tactics exceed legitimate authority, community engagement, allowing populations to express concerns before grievances escalate, recognition that respecting dignity is prerequisite for effective policing serving communities rather than antagonizing them. The enduring questions that Percy Flowers' case raises about limits of justification when responding to cultural humiliation through systematic violence, about appropriate exercise of government authority when enforcing laws that communities resist, about whether destroying property with symbolic significance creates grievances exceeding simple material losses, about how societies should memorialize events where institutional disrespect and individual desperation combined creating tragedies affecting multiple families. These remain unresolved 93 years after events, continue shaping debates about cultural sensitivity in law enforcement, about prohibition enforcement's legacy affecting federal-community relationships, about appropriate responses when authority is exercised disrespectfully. Annual gatherings at Cock County Memorial demonstrate that time doesn't resolve fundamental disagreements about moral responsibility when institutions employ tactics that unnecessarily antagonize populations, and when desperate responses create additional victims. That honest examination requires acknowledging both legitimate cultural grievances and excessive violence, that learning from history demands recognizing that effective government authority requires respecting dignity of all citizens regardless of cultural differences or economic circumstances. Modern Appalachian cultural preservation movements invoke Percy as symbol of resistance to federal authority that systematically disrespected mountain communities, argue that his case demonstrates importance of maintaining cultural practices despite external pressures and importance of demanding that government enforcement respect traditions that populations value. That systematic violence, while legally unjustifiable, represented assertion of dignity against authority, that contempt had characterized mountain people as primitive populations, undeserving respectful treatment. Critics counter that celebrating systematic killer of federal agents risks romanticizing violence and undermining legitimate law enforcement, even when acknowledging that specific tactics were indefensible, that focusing on Percy's resistance may obscure that overwhelming majority of mountain people responded to prohibition enforcement through non-violent means, including political advocacy, civil disobedience, and community organizing that didn't result in deaths. The broader implications of Percy Flowers' case extended beyond individual tragedy, when modern researchers examining prohibition enforcement discovered that coat destruction had exemplified systematic pattern where revenue agents had employed tactics designed to humiliate and intimidate rather than to conduct searches efficiently. That destroying property with cultural or personal significance had been common practice, that training implicitly encouraged through emphasizing federal authority, and through portraying mountain populations as criminals deserving aggressive treatment, regardless of whether specific individuals had violated laws. Comprehensive studies examining prohibition enforcement's cultural impacts revealed that Percy's experience hadn't been a unique incident, but had represented how federal authority had been exercised throughout Appalachian regions where traditional distilling practices had been criminalized and where enforcement had proceeded through methods demonstrating contempt for cultures that agents had viewed as backward or primitive. What distinguished Percy's case from other prohibition enforcement victims was combination of coat having exceptional symbolic significance that mountain culture made far more meaningful than similar property might have been in different contexts. Percy's systematic response eliminating all participants, creating national attention that isolated incidents of property destruction rarely generated. Trial featuring unprecedented anthropological testimony about cultural values that legal proceedings typically ignored. Imprisonment without federal acknowledgement that enforcement excesses had contributed to creating situation. Eventual legislation establishing cultural sensitivity requirements that Percy's family had advocated for decades. Most prohibition enforcement victims had suffered property destruction or harassment without systematic documentation, had lacked resources for pursuing complaints when supervisors dismissed grievances, had responded through accepting losses rather than through violence that might have drawn attention to enforcement problems, but that legal systems would have condemned as criminal regardless of provocations. Until next time, remember that Percy Flowers killed 21 federal revenue agents who destroyed his Sunday church coat during October 1931, raid that found no illegal activity. That coat represented 3 years' savings and symbolized dignity in primitive Baptist mountain culture, where proper Sunday appearance demonstrated spiritual commitment and community standing. That agents deliberately tore fabric and ground garment into mud while laughing about teaching moonshiner lessons. Despite Percy's protests about coat's significance, that Treasury supervisor dismissed Percy's complaint, characterizing destruction as regrettable accident during legitimate enforcement. That Percy systematically eliminated all raid participants within 2 months, including 6 whose participation had been peripheral. That 12-day jury deliberation examined cultural significance before convicting. That case prompted federal reforms, including Percy Flowers' Cultural Respect in Law Enforcement Act, establishing cultural sensitivity requirements, and that ultimately government authority must respect cultural dignity even when enforcing unpopular laws. That tactics demonstrating contempt for values citizens hold sacred create grievances, provoking desperate responses affecting multiple generations, when effective policing depends on maintaining relationships based on mutual respect rather than on intimidation. If this complete expanded story made you grapple with irreducible complexity of cultural humiliation and federal overreach across 93 years, the discovery that revenue agents deliberately destroyed Sunday church coat that represented 3 years' savings and that symbolized dignity and spiritual commitment in primitive Baptist mountain culture, the supervisor's dismissal of complaint, despite eyewitness testimony about agents laughing while grinding coat into mud, the systematic elimination of 21 agents, including 6 whose participation had been peripheral rather than central to destruction, the 12-day jury deliberation examining cultural significance through anthropological testimony before reaching guilty verdicts, the federal legislation establishing cultural sensitivity requirements named for Percy, the preserved coat displayed at memorial showing torn fabric and mud stains as physical evidence of deliberate vandalism, the impossible questions about whether killing 21 people could ever be justified when responding to profound cultural humiliation, and whether alternatives existed when administrative complaint had been dismissed without serious consideration. Leave your like and share. Subscribe for stories examining how cultural insensitivity in law enforcement creates grievances, how government authority exercised disrespectfully generates resentment, undermining enforcement effectiveness, how systematic violence affects everyone when institutional failures demonstrate contempt for populations being policed. Comment about whether Percy's campaign was proportional response to coat destruction, or whether continued advocacy through political and legal channels should have been pursued, whether 93 years and federal reforms provide adequate resolution when violence killed 21, including peripheral participants whose culpability was limited, whether memorial should emphasize cultural dignity and enforcement excesses, or acknowledge complexity, including agents' deaths, creating additional victims. Because these questions persist wherever law enforcement operates in culturally distinct communities, wherever government authority is exercised without respecting populations' values and practices, wherever citizens must choose between accepting institutional disrespect and employing desperate measures that legal systems condemn, but that cultural humiliation makes comprehensible when official channels systematically dismiss grievances about tactics that unnecessarily antagonize communities, through demonstrating contempt for traditions that citizens hold sacred and that dignity requires. Maintaining despite economic hardship, and despite external pressures to abandon cultural practices that new laws or enforcement methods attempt to suppress. The enduring legacy of Percy Flowers' 1931 systematic campaign continues influencing how federal law enforcement agencies approach cultural sensitivity training and how communities advocate for respectful treatment when government authority is exercised in ways that affect traditional practices or that involve interactions where cultural misunderstandings can create conflicts. His case remains most frequently cited example in discussions about how seemingly minor property destruction can represent profound violations when cultural contexts make objects or practices symbolically significant far beyond their material value. How enforcement tactics that agents view as routine demonstrations of authority can be experienced by communities as deliberate attacks on dignity and identity that cultural preservation requires defending. Modern descendants of both Percy and of agents killed during his campaign continue participating in Reconciliation Foundation's work, demonstrate that acknowledging complexity and maintaining dialogue across generations can create understanding, if not resolution, of moral questions that systematic violence and institutional disrespect raised. That learning from historical tragedies requires sustained commitment to examining multiple perspectives, rather than simplifying events into narratives that celebrate or condemn without recognizing how institutional failures and individual desperation combined, creating outcomes that all involved would have preferred preventing if cultural understanding and respectful enforcement had been. Priorities that Prohibition-era federal authority had valued as highly as demonstrating power, through aggressive tactics that mountain communities experienced as systematic attacks on ways of life that generations had maintained.